Alright, so this is going to be pretty simple. It doesn't take a whole lot of prep work, but it does take a bit of monitoring. We spent last week trying to get these proportions right. This is to make some rice pudding. So for rice pudding, for this recipe, I'm going to use about a quart of milk, which is 32 ounces. Before this I'm going to do about 24 ounces of milk and then 8 ounces of half and half just for a little bit more creaminess. And you can use this size pan, works pretty well. This is an 8 by 8 inch or a 20 by 20 centimeter glass pan. Just measure straight on here and add everything in at once. I'm going to 24 ounces of milk. Add 8 ounces of half and half. That. Now to this we're going to add the rice. The last batch that I did was, I did 2/3 of a cup of rice. It was a little thick and set up pretty thick at the end. So what I'm going to do for this one is a half a cup. A little bit less rice. So I'm using Arborio rice. It is a shorter grain rice. You can kind of see they're not very long. I like these just whenever I'm making something that needs to have the rice stick together. It tends to release the starch even more. To the rice we'll add about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, a 1/4 cup of sugar, teaspoon of vanilla, so to this I am going to add a half cup of raisins. You don't have to add raisins to this if you don't want. And I add them in now rather than later because as the rice cooks and the raisins are in the hot milk, it will kind of reconstitute the raisins. They'll puff back out and not be as dry. So the last bit that we need is 2 teaspoons of butter. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to cube it and then break it up into it so that they kind of float about. You can melt this and pour it in, but it's just one more step I don't have to do if I do it this way. Keeps the recipe simple. And it's fine if they're floating around in chunks. As it heats up in the oven, it will melt pretty quick and then just kind of stay floating on the top. And that's everything. So this will go in the oven at 300 degrees for about 2 hours. And you want to stir it at least every 30 minutes. It's going to, as it starts to get cooked, it's going to start sticking to the bottom. That's why the glass pan is really good. You can just use a wooden spoon to kind of stir it in the oven as you go. So about an hour. You still want to be careful. These I put a sheet pan underneath, so as I pull this, if I pull it out and it sloshes, I'm not going to get it into the stove itself. So I added about a teaspoon of cinnamon. You sprinkle it with cinnamon later, but I found that it doesn't quite mix in as I'd like. So I'm trying this out to see how it goes. Otherwise, you sprinkle the final result with cinnamon. So it's not going to stick to the bottom much. At this point, it's still pretty liquid. Just let it keep going. Okay, we're getting closer to the 2-hour mark. It's not as sloshy. Really see that the rice is starting to cook. You're going to start getting films on the top. You can just like push that down in to the pudding. Just make sure nothing's sticking to the bottom. Let it keep going. You let this go a little longer. I'm going to pull it out and see how it does, because with the starch leaching into the milk, this should thicken up as it cools down, and that way it'll give you a nice creamy texture when it's cooled down. So to finish this off as it cools, I've taken a teaspoon of sugar and a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon so that I can sprinkle the top. You can just do this with straight cinnamon, so I find it a little harder to handle it and get it to kind of come down evenly. So mixing it with sugar gives it a little bit more of a kind of coarse texture to work with. Okay, and that's good. We'll just let it cool and check on it then. So that's set up pretty nice. Scoops out well. The depth side to this recipe is that this recipe does not use eggs. So a lot of rice pudding recipes that you'll find use eggs as like a binder that'll thicken it. This just uses the starch from the rice and the soaking of the liquid as it cooks to thicken it.